Welcome to The Debate. Today we are stepping into what I consider the most dense, difficult, and frankly, the most beautiful texts of the liturgical year, Palm Sunday. Specifically, we're looking at the commentaries of Marie-Noël Thabot on the readings for Year A. And, usually when people think of Palm Sunday, the mind jumps to the procession, the palm branches, the donkey, the hosannas. It feels like a parade. It feels triumphant. But if you actually sit down with the texts we're analyzing today, Isaiah 50, Psalm 22, Philippians, and Matthew's Passion, you realize, well, we aren't looking at a parade. We are looking at a crime scene. We are dealing with betrayal, torture, state execution, and the terrifying silence of God.
It is a heavy lineup, to say the least. And I think the tension we need to unpack today isn't just about the events themselves, what happened to Jesus on a specific Friday in Jerusalem. The real debate, and what I want to push you on, is the architecture of these texts. How are we supposed to read them? Are we looking at a preordained theological blueprint, a divine script written centuries in advance that the Messiah simply acts out? Or are we actually reading the desperate, gritty survival manual of a nation, Israel, trying to make sense of its own near extinction during the Babylonian exile?
That is the core friction, absolutely. It's that tension between history and theology. So I'll take the position that these texts demonstrate a profound theological unity that transcends their historical moment. I'd argue that the Passion narrative and its Old Testament antecedents reveal a divine consistency. Jesus fulfills the role of the suffering servant not by accident and not just because he's copying an old scroll, but because he embodies the perfection of listening, of absolute trust that Israel was called to but struggled to maintain. He transforms that historical feeling of abandonment into a victory of grace.
And I come at it from a different way. I think if we rush too quickly to the theological bow on top, to the victory, we do a disservice to the text and to the human experience it describes. I'll argue that we have to ground these texts in their gritty historical context, specifically the 6th century BC exile. Isaiah and the Psalms were originally about the people of Israel surviving a collective death sentence. The victory here isn't a simple reward system. It is a complex, paradoxical reversal where the insiders are blind and the outsiders are the ones who see the truth. It's about survival in the mud, not just glory in the clouds.
Let's begin with the foundation then. We have to start with the prophet Isaiah, chapter 50, and this figure of the servant of God. Now, in the Christian liturgy, we almost automatically overlay Jesus' face onto this figure. We read it as a direct prophecy. But Thabot highlights something fascinating here regarding the definition of this servant. She points out that the core characteristic, the defining trait of the servant, is listening.
Morning after morning, he wakens my ear, as the text says.
Exactly. But we have to be careful with that word listening. In our modern context, listening is passive. You listen to music while you do the dishes. You listen to the wind. It happens to you. But the book argues that biblically, listening is an act of extreme volition. It implies absolute trust. It is the opposite of rebellion. The servant is defined by this reciprocal confidence. God entrusts submission to the servant, and the servant accepts it with a face hard as stone.
That phrase, face hard as stone or face like flint, is striking. But I want to pull us back to the ground. You're framing this listening as a high spiritual discipline, almost like a monastic silence. But the book points out the context. Isaiah isn't writing to a monk. He's writing to a nation in a labor camp. He's writing to his contemporaries in Babylon, who are being crushed by a foreign empire.
The historical context is undeniable, but the spiritual response is what matters.
But the response is born of trauma. The text says, I offered my back to those who struck me, my cheeks to those who tore out my beard. This isn't metaphorical piety. This is the physical reality of a conquered people. My point is that Isaiah is telling Israel, you are the servant. You, the people, are the ones who must set your face like flint. You are the ones who must not rebel against this history, but trust that God is working through this national trauma. It's a pep talk for survival, not just a prophecy about a future individual.
I accept that the initial audience was corporate Israel, but that's the beauty of the theological layering. The corporate identity of Israel as the servant was inconsistent. I mean, let's be honest. Israel didn't always listen. They rebelled, they complained in the desert, they folded under pressure. That but's point is that while the text has historical roots, its ultimate realization is found in Jesus. He takes that history of exile and perfects the response. Where Israel faltered in its trust, Jesus offers the perfect ear. He is the servant who actually succeeds in sustaining the weary with a word because he himself draws strength from that absolute, unbroken connection with the Father.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. By focusing on his success, you might minimize the agony of the attempt. The listening Thabit speaks of is the desperate struggle of a refugee people trying to maintain their identity when their God seems to have lost the war. When the text says, "I have not hidden my face from insults and spitting," that is the lived reality of the Jewish people in captivity. If we jump straight to Jesus, we risk treating the exile as just a prequel instead of a tragedy in its own right.
But doesn't the gospel writer explicitly make that connection? Jesus is the one who steps into that tragedy. He doesn't avoid it. He enters the same space of insults and spitting. And unlike the corporate nation, which often responded with violence or despair, he responds with that face like flint. He embodies the perfect Israel. He is the one disciple who truly listens morning after morning all the way to the end.
That leads us directly to the end you're talking about, and specifically to Psalm 22. This is the centerpiece of the debate for me. My God, why have you abandoned me? Now, Thabit emphasizes that we must not strip this cry of its anguish.
I agree we shouldn't strip it of meaning, but we must interpret it correctly within the canon.
The correct interpretation historically is that this is a cry of distress before the silence of God. The book notes that the Bible validates the right of the sufferer to scream. If we treat this merely as a line in a play that Jesus recites because he knows he's supposed to, like checking a box on a messianic to-do list, we lose the reality of the incarnation. This is the prayer of a people, again, Israel in exile, facing a death sentence. It is an execution.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it stops halfway through the text. And this is where Thalabit is brilliant. She insists that we must read the psalm to the end. In the liturgy and in our minds, we often stop at the suffering. We hear the cry of abandonment and we freeze there. But the psalm itself transforms. It moves from a cry of despair to a hymn of thanksgiving. You have answered me. I will proclaim your name to my brothers.
It does shift, yes. It pivots from minor key to major key.
It's not just a shift, it's a total reversal. Thabit compares Psalm 22 to an ex voto.
We should probably define that for the listeners. An ex voto is typically an object, a plaque, a model ship, a painting, placed in a church or temple to give thanks for a specific miracle or survival. Like, I was drowning, I prayed, I survived, here is my offering.
Exactly. It is the proof of life. Thabit says the psalm is the ex voto. The structure of the poem isn't a suicide note. It is the song of someone who looked death in the face and was pulled back. The central point isn't the death, it's the survival. It's the survivor thanking God for not abandoning them, effectively. So when Jesus recites this on the cross, he isn't just screaming in the dark. He is beginning the prayer of the survivor. He is invoking the ex voto, even before the resurrection happens.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it's that clean. Yes, it ends in praise, but look at the imagery in the middle. They pierce my hands and my feet. They divide my garment. Christians read that and say, look, a vision of the crucifixion. It's a literal description.
Because it fits the event perfectly.
It fits, but Thabit points out that in the context of the return from exile, this was a metaphor for the near annihilation of the people. Being pierced or bound hand and foot was how you transported slaves and prisoners of war. Dividing garments is what soldiers did to the conquered. The dogs and scoundrels surrounding the sufferer weren't Roman soldiers initially. They were the foreign nations circling Israel like vultures.
So you view it purely as a national allegory?
I view it as collective memory. The crucifixion described in the psalm was the geopolitical execution of Israel. They were dead as a nation. The ex voto is valid, but it's an ex voto for a nation that barely survived a geopolitical execution. If we make it only about Jesus' physical cross, we miss the collective memory of a people who felt God had left the building. The power of Jesus using it is that he is identifying with that specific historical trauma.
But doesn't the metaphor prove the theological point? If the psalm is about a near-death experience of the nation that turns into praise, isn't the resurrection the ultimate fulfillment of that pattern? Jesus enters into that precise space, the feeling of abandonment, the physical destruction, and turns it into the ultimate ex voto. He praises God in the great assembly of the new humanity. The psalm fits him better than it fits the nation, because the nation eventually fell again. Jesus' victory is permanent. He takes the metaphor of the pierced hands and makes it a reality, so that the ex voto can be eternal.
That leads us to the nature of that victory. How is it achieved? Because it clearly isn't achieved by force. This brings us to the letter to the Philippians. You would argue, I assume, that this is the explanation of how the servant triumphs?
Precisely. And this is where Thaba warns us against a very specific, very common intellectual trap: arithmetic thinking.
Arithmetic thinking? You mean like keeping score?
Exactly. The ledger book. We tend to read Philippians, Jesus humbled himself, therefore God exalted him, as a transaction. Jesus was a good boy, he ate his vegetables, he obeyed the rules, so God gave him a cookie. God gave him the name above all names as a salary. Thaba says this is contrary to the logic of grace. It implies that Jesus earned his divinity back through suffering.
But the text says, because of this, God exalted him. It implies causality. It's hard to get away from the idea that the exaltation is a result of the humiliation.
Causality, yes, but not commerce. It's not a wage, it's a consequence of nature. The contrast Thabit draws, and this is critical, is between Jesus and Adam, or specifically, Eve. Think about the garden. What was the first sin? It wasn't just eating a piece of fruit. It was an act of grasping. Eve wanted to be like God, so she took, she stole. It was a claim of rights, a revendication.
She grabbed for status.
Right. And Jesus? Jesus, who actually had the condition of God, who had the status Eve wanted, did not retain strictly his rank. He did not grasp. He emptied himself, kenosis.
He made himself nothing.
But frames this as gift versus theft. Because Jesus is pure welcome, pure reception, pure obedience. He can receive the exaltation. You cannot steal the name of God. You can only receive it as a gratuitous gift. He is exalted not because he earned it like a wage, but because his self-emptying created the space for God's glory to fill him completely. He didn't unclench his fist to get a reward. He lived with open hands, and so God could place the universe in them.
I find the distinction between reward and gift to be subtle, perhaps too subtle for the person actually suffering. But I appreciate the contrast with grasping. It suggests that power in this kingdom works in reverse. You gain by letting go. However, I want to pivot to the Gospel of Matthew, because this is where the rubber meets the road. We move from the theological hymn of Philippians to the messy, dirty details of the Passion. And Matthew includes details the others don't.
Such as?
The 30 pieces of silver.
Ah, yes, the price of betrayal.
But Thurbit points out it's not just a random sum. It wasn't just a lot of money. Under the law in Exodus, 30 pieces of silver was the legal price for purchasing a slave, or specifically the compensation price if your ox gored someone else's slave.
Represents total commodification.
It represents contempt. It demonstrates the absolute disdain the religious authorities had for Jesus. To them, he wasn't a threat. He wasn't a prophet. He was livestock. He was a commodity to be traded and disposed of. This brings me back to my point about the insiders, the people who knew the law, who knew the value of the silver. They used it to express their scorn. They were saying, this man is worth the price of a dead slave.
That is a powerful point, and it highlights the irony that runs through Matthew's account. Talbot notes the paradox of recognition. Who are the people in this narrative who actually see Jesus for who he is? It isn't the high priests. It isn't the insiders. It is not the experts in the scripture.
It's the pagans, it's the outsiders, the people who shouldn't know anything.
Right. The insiders mock him. They say, "If you are the Son of God, come down." They use the title Son of God as a taunt. But look at who treats him with dignity.
You have Pilate's wife, a detail found only in Matthew. She sends a message to her husband right in the middle of the trial. "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much over him today in a dream." Here you have a pagan woman, the wife of the occupier, receiving a divine communication about the just one, while the Jewish authorities are busy buying his blood with slave money.
And then you have Pilate himself washing his hands. Now, we can argue about his cowardice, and he is a coward, but he explicitly states, "I am innocent of this man's blood." He recognizes an innocence that the Sanhedrin refuses to see.
But the ultimate recognition, the climax of this paradox, comes at the moment of death, the centurion.
Truly, this was the Son of God.
Think about the weight of that. The title Son of God is stripped from him by the priests in mockery and then bestowed upon him by the executioner in awe. Thabit argues that this is the moment the victory is revealed. The death isn't a defeat, it's a revelation that converts the pagan world.
And that revelation is accompanied by cosmic signs. This is another detail unique to Matthew that I love. The earthquake, the rocks splitting, and the saints rising from the tombs.
It is a very apocalyptic scene. It borders on the surreal.
But notice the timing. Thabit points out they rise after his resurrection, but the event is triggered by his death. It signifies that the death of Jesus immediately breaks the bounds of death itself. It's not just a moral victory where the centurion feels bad, it is an ontological victory. The ex voto of Psalm 22 is answered instantly. The earth shakes because the power of death has been broken. The universe physically responds to the listening of the servant.
I come at it from a different way regarding the victory. I think looking at the earthquakes distracts us from the human tragedy that Matthew also highlights, which is Judas.
Judas? You think he is the counterpoint?
I do. Matthew is the only one who details Judas's remorse in this way. He returns the 30 pieces of silver. He confesses, "I have sinned in betraying innocent blood." Compare his reaction to the priests. He is crushed by guilt. The priests say, "What is that to us? See to it yourself."
That is one of the coldest lines in Scripture. What is that to us?
Ice cold. But it highlights that Judas, despite his betrayal, actually realized the horror of what he did. He realized the value of the life he sold, that it was innocent blood. The tragedy of the disciple who realizes his error too late is, to me, more poignant than the rock splitting. It grounds the narrative back in the human failure to trust. Judas didn't have the listening ear of the servant. He took matters into his own hands.
That's an interesting point. Though I would frame it differently. Judas's despair comes precisely because he lacked the confidence we spoke of earlier in Isaiah. He was still trapped in arithmetic thinking. He thought, "I have done X amount of evil, therefore I am doomed." He couldn't imagine a forgiveness big enough to cover his betrayal. He didn't believe the ex voto was possible for him. He grasped at suicide as a solution, just as he grasped at the money.
That's a fair reading. He couldn't see the gift, but I think the boat's analysis of the paradox is the key here. The weakness of God, the slave price, the silence, the death, is stronger than men. The pagans recognizing him proves that God's plan works through the failure of the insiders.
It is a paradox. The King of the Jews is rejected by the Jews and acclaimed by the Romans. The Son of God is mocked by the priests and confessed by the soldier.
And the servant who listens is betrayed by the disciple who stopped listening.
And this brings us back to the unity of the text. Whether it's the servant in Isaiah setting his face like flint, or Jesus standing silent before Pilate, the power comes from the same source: trust. Thabit emphasizes that Jesus is the one who did not hide his face. He faced the reality of human sin, the betrayal, the slave price, the mockery, and he absorbed it all through the power of listening to the Father. He didn't turn away.
But we must never forget the cost of that absorption. My takeaway from Thabit's analysis is the grit of it. Israel in exile really felt abandoned. Jesus on the cross really felt the silence of God. These aren't play-acting moments. The power of these texts lies in their ability to articulate the darkest moments of human history: genocide, exile, execution,
and insists that even there, a voice can cry out.
And my takeaway is that the cry is heard. The golden thread connecting Isaiah, the Psalms, and Matthew is indeed listening. But it's reciprocal. The servant listens to God, and eventually God listens to the servant. You have answered me. Whether it is Israel in Babylon or Jesus in Jerusalem, the refusal to despair, the refusal to stop trusting in God's benevolence, is what allows life to emerge from death.
It is a victory, I grant you, but it is a victory recognized primarily by those who have eyes to see the paradox.
As it always is.
We will leave it there for today. Thank you for engaging with these complex perspectives on the Palm Sunday texts.
We encourage you to read the source material from Marine Oil Thabut yourselves to catch all the nuances we couldn't cover. Until next time.
Goodbye.